Hello and welcome. One of the most remarkable success stories of the last decade has been the rise of India. Through wars, a pandemic and global uncertainties, India is now the world's 5th largest economy and will soon be the world's 3rd largest economy by the end of this decade. Now, Viksit Bharat, or a developed India by 2047, is not just a dream, but a destiny. An India poised for the next big leap. That's the theme of the TV9 What India Thinks Today Global Summit. 20 keynotes, 30 sessions and 75 speakers. The second installment of our summit, less than a week from now, is bigger and better. We host a range of global speakers, international influencers and trendsetters invested in the India rising story.
Well, and starting today, we will be recording 6 special shows to count down to this mega event, which takes place in New Delhi on the 25th, 26th and 27th of February. And today on this show, we are going to set the stage for a subject which is one of the most important themes of this global summit. India emerging as the voice of the global south and how it compares to China in that role. Sandeep, of course, we also have with us Kartikeya Sharma and Aditya Rajkol, our colleagues, joining us to discuss this entire issue. Before I take this to Aditya and Kartikeya, I just want to, share with our viewers a couple of examples of why I believe, and a lot of other people believe, that India has definitely emerged as a strong voice of the global south. You know, for the last couple of years, Aditya, you'll bear me out on this, Prime Minister Modi, our Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar have at various multilateral forums spoken for the global south, the interest of the global south, the hardships and the challenges that these countries face. But I think what really put a stamp on it, Sandeep, is our G20 presidency.
Absolutely.
The fact that throughout that 1 year when India held the G20 presidency, all these issues pertaining to the global south constituted the leitmotif of our G20 presidency. It found a repeated mention, including the New Delhi Declaration that was adopted unanimously by all member states. And let's not forget, it was at the initiative of Prime Minister Modi that a historic measure was taken. The African Union was granted full membership of the G20 summit, something that the Prime Minister has repeatedly said is very close to his heart. And if I could just lay out one more issue, which I think in a very interesting way tells us why India has emerged as a voice of the global south. You know, India received a lot of global criticism when we continue to import Russian oil. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in fact, our oil imports went up 13 times. And not only did India take the stand that our interests and the interests of the Indian people will precede everything else, Jaishankar very famously called out the Western media's hypocrisy by saying that what New Delhi buys in a month is something that Europe buys in one afternoon.
Yes.
So the way he chided them, I think, is something that made global headlines. And why do I believe that India's step in this direction was not just in its own interest, but it actually helped further the interests of the global south? Because late last year, while speaking in London, Mr. Jaishankar said, I am waiting for the West to say thank you to India. Why did he say that? He said because of our continued oil imports from Russia, India managed to stabilize oil and gas markets, and we managed global inflation. Had it not been for that strategic purchase policy decision that we took, the entire world would have suffered. And of course, very interestingly, Sandeep, over the weekend, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, of course, Mr. Jaishankar has a way with words.
Yes.
So very cleverly, when he was asked by the journalist how India manages to balance its ties between the US and Russia, he said, well, if I'm smart enough to have multiple options, you should admire me. Yes. But you know, that light-hearted comment apart, I think India has displayed through a series of measures and policy decisions that it's taken that it is truly the voice of the global south. Kartikeya? Your thoughts?
I think, you know, India will have its challenges because China truly is not in the race for global south. I have a contrarian view. China is in race for the global north.
Right.
One. And for global south, China thinks that they are the places of investment. Either Belt and Road, if you look at the way they strategically build the ports, or if they have built their naval bases, or they have reclaimed land in South China Sea. I think they have a different approach. India wants to lead the global south because there's a continuity in Indian foreign policy despite a couple of discontinuities in Modi administration, which everyone talks about. The continuity in the foreign policy, which very few people realize under Modi, is that despite redefining our relationship with, say, for example, Israel, or talking about strategic autonomy with Russia, or having a deep science and military based understanding with France and United States of America, we have not become allies. Even Quad is not written in that language. It's non-military in nature. We have continued to put boots on ground, but under United Nations auspice,
Right.
which means that we are the largest senders of our forces, but under the United Nations. We didn't send troops to Afghanistan. We didn't do that.
We didn't send troops to Iraq either.
We didn't send troops to Iraq either.
Famously.
We built Salma Dam. There's an Indira
Yeah.
Gandhi library there. In fact, we also take care of that. The famous Mazar of Babur, the renovation
Yes.
was done by Ministry of External Affairs. So in India, that way is pretty eclectic when it comes to global south. Our priorities are actually the priorities of the poor countries. Why? Because we have undergone that phenomena in 60s and 70s, which is being taxed for not being carbon neutral, or the new technologies which the world is regulating, which is EV centric, lithium centric, or our priorities is how to get ready for a climate change challenge, because climate change is not about temperature or AC, climate change is about food security.
Absolutely, and that new phrase that the Prime Minister introduced, climate justice,
Yes,
I think
and
that was a
climate
very
change is
important...
about new routes. Now, Russian
yeah.
and Chinese, Russian specifically, they have weaponized the entire Arctic. Very few people know
Yeah.
that they have an Arctic force
Yes.
that has been under training for last 25 years.
Right.
They have a floating nuclear power base there. So, we have our challenges. It's like when we talk about soft power, I'll give you an example, then I'll throw it to Aditya. It does not change the behavior of a neighbor.
Yeah.
How much soft power we use against Pakistan, it doesn't change Pakistan. How much soft power we used for Afghanistan and the development of the citizens, it didn't change the behavior of Taliban. So there is limitation to what we do. So global south is full of challenges, but India is poised to steer it because one, our economy is strong. We are not 1998.
Yeah.
Americans can't do that to us again. Second, we have political
By
stability.
98 you mean the Pokhran test?
Pokhran.
The
And the
aftermath of
sanctions.
that, and the
Yes.
sanctions, of course.
Second, we are politically stable. We have a powerful Prime Minister with a global connect. And third, there is consensus. We are not like divided American politics,
Right.
like
Yes.
Trump and Biden, you know, where people cannot come to a consensus. There is a unity in domestic politics on
Yes.
certain foreign affairs issue, which gives great authority to Prime Minister Modi to take tough decisions. So we are poised well,
Yeah.
but we have our challenges.
Yeah, actually, that's another segment we're going to talk about Prime Minister Modi's role in shaping it. But Aditya, you have a view on this. This is a very interesting aspect that Karthikeya raised, the fact that China is actually aspiring for the global north. It actually wants to displace the United States. Whereas I think we are very happy in doing a non-alignment plus, given the fact that our economy is, firing on all cylinders. It wants to lift the global south along with us, and that largely explains our stance, especially in the G20 summit.
Firstly, Sandeep, I don't think there's a debate when it comes to the global south. India has not been only wanting to, but India has emerged already as the voice of
Yes.
the global south. And there are numerous examples to state over the last 1 year. And as Neha pointed out, it happened during the G20 summit really, because it began with the Voice of Global South Summit,
Yes.
which India-led Prime Minister Narendra Modi reached out to all these leaders.
Right.
And, one has to understand the history. One has to understand the rapport and the connect that India shares with the countries of the global south and not China. India has a shared history with
Yes.
all these countries of colonialism, of apartheid that has happened.
Right.
So the pain is similar, the anguish is similar. And then there's a debate raging between the developed and the developing nations.
Right.
There too, India has emerged as a leader. India has prioritized the sentiments, the concerns and the demands of the global south and reached out not just to the United Nations and several other multilateral forums, but more importantly, during India's G20 presidency,
Yes.
led that effort, and finally that culminated in African Union becoming the permanent member. And that was a very emotional scene
That is a
that was
historic
witnessed there.
moment, I think, Neha, getting all the African countries in on board, and that kind of said that we were ready to walk the talk on the global south. In fact, our background here, I just realized when you were talking about the north and south thing, you have Xi Jinping looking northwards and you have the Prime Minister looking southwards, both indicating their priorities where it kind of lies.
Can I add something?
Yeah, of course.
You see, there is one, there's one distinct shift in this administration. If you look at our history under Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, we were wedded to internationalism and socialism in our foreign policy.
Yes.
Under Narasimha Rao, with the collapse of communism and demise of socialism in West and South Asia, the shift was towards internationalism, which is of globalization.
Right.
Now, BJP is a different party because every party's political setup influences foreign policy. So the Prime Minister is also reflecting those roots. So I just want to take you through those roots, because when we talk about Global South, we must understand who inspires them. It's like Moropant Pingle of RSS or Guru Murthy. It was way back in 1998, people within the RSS and BJP were talking about India first. They were saying what was the basis of the Indian freedom struggle. So the argument was it was nationalism wedded to Swadeshi.
Right.
Okay, more like America first. So our Global South is also has an element of that Atmanirbharta which Prime Minister and the RSS has been talking about. India first, as she said, Neha, but married to Swadeshi, manufacturing, self-reliance. And then it gets married to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So they are all interconnected words. So if you look at 4 or 5 words of soft power, I'll read them out to you a little later. It has an element of Sanskriti, it has an element of Samvad, it has an element of Samanvay, it has an element of Samman, and it has an element of Suraksha. Okay, I got them right. All S. So the Global South is a very natural outcome of what Prime Minister has grown up thinking, which means that we have to lead with cooperation, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Because I think when we talk about North, it's a different ball game.
Right, and the North is largely colonialism, all of that baggage. And incidentally, China was also a victim. That's what surprises me. China was a victim of colonialism. They were occupied by the Japanese, they were occupied by the Western countries. They call it a century of humiliation.
How will any country lead whose traffic in context of movement of people globally after COVID has gone down by 62%.
Right.
China is under glorious isolation under Xi Jinping.
Yes.
It's down by 62%. 62%. So which means that people aren't coming to China and Chinese aren't going out of China. How can they lead Global South? I think you are right. India will lead Global South because it wants to lead Global South, because you need to be open for Global South. But China is a closed country right now with hoardings in Shanghai. Look out for spies.
Look out for spies, and don't forget those crowds of Chinese trying to break into the United States, the illegal migrants.
That's true.
I mean, it's absolutely shocking to see the...
Sandeep, 2 events that have happened in recent history that have been really defining and that have shaped the world opinion is, of course, the pandemic. At a time when the world was struggling with the vaccine, India stood up and actually gave 100 countries vaccine. 150 others actually took vaccines and bought vaccines from India. And that has shaped the world opinion as well. I mean, look at all the countries of the Global South. Look at that defining image of one of the heads of the states actually touching the feet of the Prime Minister and crying while receiving him. Similarly with the African Union President,
the Pacific Islanders, they were...
I think that's been a defining moment, and that's something that history will remember. Secondly, is the time of the war. There are 2 wars that have shaped the world opinion, divided the world completely. And here is India, that is not with one bloc or the other, but is talking about not an era of war.
Yes.
Prime Minister speaking that at the G20 summit in Bali. And also India emerging as a global peace catalyst. You know, we are not brokers, we are not Qatar, but we are certainly talking to all sides.
Yes.
You know, Prime Minister is speaking to Putin at the same time Biden, at the same time the Ukrainian president as well. So we have close important ties, be it trade, be it defense, be it cultural aspirations, be it education, and that will certainly continue.
You know, it's like this map. I'll give you an example, then I rest my case. It's like this map. Africa is far bigger than Greenland, but if you look at the representation of Greenland in Europe, it looks bigger.
The Mercator
entire
projection.
Europe, the half of it can be inside Australia, where it looks smaller.
Yes.
So the map sums it up.
Absolutely.
Because this is the universal map used for gridding, military purpose. But it does not represent South America, Africa, and Australia. You have to use this map because there is no other real scale representation. But the fact is that that's not the real representation of Greenland or Russia.
Absolutely not. And in fact, you know, this point we spoke about earlier, the fact that how India and China are different, Neha, in the way they approach the global south.
Yes.
The Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly.
It's a classic case of China saying, I know what's good for you, what's good for the rest of the world. Here is my $1 trillion plan for the whole world. Everybody needs to sign up and line up behind me. And you have India with a, you know, very cautious saying about a couple of years back, it takes a cautious route and say, listen, we will leave it to the countries of the global south, a lot of them, to decide what's good for them.
In fact,
and if you look at the kind of interest rates as well, China charges something like 3%, and India is exactly half of that. That clearly tells you the difference between the approach of these two countries.
That's what I wanted to talk about, and I also want to build on what Aditya said earlier to draw a distinction between how these countries have dealt with the rest of the world. You know, Aditya talked about how vaccine Maitri or India's vaccine diplomacy earned us a lot of goodwill and praise from all over the world at a time when we ourselves were struggling with the massive population that we have. But you know, we were sort of large-hearted enough to help out 100 countries with life-saving vaccines at the height of the pandemic.
Because it was the right thing to do.
It was the right thing to do, and it earned us a lot of global goodwill.
It did.
So the pharmacy of the world, in a sense, was suddenly the vaccine manufacturing hub of the world. Now compare that with exactly what you've just mentioned. China's attitude towards its smaller neighbors. You know, the term that's now used is debt trap diplomacy.
Trap diplomacy.
That is what China has been practicing, you know, through its Belt and Road Initiative. The expansionism and the hegemony that have been on display, that is not something that you see with India. India is not a country that is eyeing someone's territory. We're not seen as a threat to anybody. We are not seen as expansionists. We're not seen as bullies.
We're a status quo as power, I guess.
And you know, I just want to quickly give out a few examples of what China has done to smaller Asian countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it would be very safe to call it economic coercion and bullying, you know, under the guise of offering economic help to countries which it has eventually turned into its satellites. Pakistan is of course a great example, but before that, countries like Sri Lanka, it lost an asset like Hambantota port to China, Mombasa port, Kenya losing it to China, several areas of Pakistan thanks to the CPEC.
And let's not forget the Maldives.
The Maldives.
It's almost there.
The Maldives is almost there. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, it is a very long list. India doesn't do that. India doesn't do that to its friends. India doesn't do that to its neighbors. And India, if anything, it's looking to safeguard and further the interests of the global south. It is not acting as a hegemonic expansionist bully.
So then going back to what Karthik has said, that then perhaps China is correct in doing what it did, because this is exactly the model the global north did to enslave all these countries by colonialism.
China is a neo-colonizer.
So
like for example, in Cambodia, China has taken over the electricity grid. Tajikistan, obviously they don't have a port, but they have lost a portion of the land. They had to give it back to the Chinese. So there's no Chinese model of development. That's Chinese model of influence.
Yes.
There is no Chinese model of development for Southeast Asia, West Asia. China is trying to reorder the world for itself. For example, China's militarization of the third pole. It is to control water for South Asia and Southeast Asia. Who wants to militarize the third pole? They are militarizing the third pole. So I don't think that the cooperation they'll get. But the challenge, again, I'll say for India is that we have to match up China in economy. Years ago, there was a very famous interview by Arun Shourie, I think when Vajpayee was in power. It was about the priorities, and they said that next 15 years we have to match up China, because China continues to grow and the difference is 10 times, then we will not have the capacity, because ultimately the will has to be married with strength, and the strength has to be married to your ability to actualize what you want to do. That's the most important thing. G20 was important because everyone said there will be no consensus.
Right.
I think why do we celebrate G20?
Yes.
There will be no draft.
Yeah.
There will be no draft. We had a draft.
Exactly.
However we managed it, it's irrelevant. It's like ek ball se jito ya do ball se jito. We won. We won that day.
Right.
So Prime Minister delivered. So I think it showed diplomatic heft, muscle, market, his personality, but all came together. But again, I would say the challenges is the way the politics of North is reordering the world, which is the war in Syria and the Israel theater, the so-called tension in the Taiwan theater, the so-called tension in Ukrainian theater, the complete collapse of the economic corridor, which had to go through Saudi Arabia. These are our challenges.
And Aditya, you saw Prime Minister Modi there at the G20 summit. Tell us how he came out of literally nowhere. No one had an idea of what he stood for in foreign policy. In 2014, as late as 2014, a few weeks before the swearing in, everyone was asking, what is his vision for the world? Is it going to be one of revenge because he was denied a visa to the United States? And exactly the opposite happened.
In fact, in the last 10 years, now that I look back, and I've covered quite a few national security and foreign affairs aspects, I see quite a few events that have happened out of nowhere.
Yes.
And nobody could have guessed it, really. I was there at the Bharat Mandapam when G20 summit happened, and I was interacting with a lot of European, particularly European, commentators and foreign policy experts. And all these wonks had this idea that there will be no consensus. They had almost drafted their editorials stating that it has led to yet another failure.
Right.
And India, under India's presidency. And it was shocking, really, for them to digest this fact that suddenly Prime Minister appeared in this 2-minute speech.
And on day one.
On day one. And stating that within a few hours we have a consensus.
Yes.
And that is for the world to see. But the larger point here, Sandeep, that I want to also discuss between India and China on the global south aspect is the rules-based order.
Yeah.
And this is the world not recognizing China for adopting or accepting or going by the principles of rules-based order.
Right.
Look at the ties that Canada has with China.
Yes.
And there's a diplomatic standoff, there is espionage that is continuously happening, Chinese police stations really stationed in Canada. Look at the ties that Australia and China have on the other hand. So there are similar other countries that have called out this kind of attitude that China has. Look at the situation in South China Sea continuously, and then adopting the same kind of mechanism and threats and hegemony towards Sri Lanka, India, in the Indian Ocean region, sending spy ships.
Right.
So this has been called out, and the larger aspect here is the trust factor. When India and China, yes, you can compare and say that Chinese are far ahead in economy and we have to catch up. That's a reality, that's a fact that we have to digest. But when you spark this debate throughout the world, that who do you trust? Who believes in the international rules-based order? Who believes in not an era of war, but have a global peace catalyst? Let's believe in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam.
Right.
That's where India takes the center stage.
And China is the naughty boy in the room.
And can I just add to what he's saying? Aditya is absolutely right. That the fact that China is practically a dictatorship, and we pride ourselves on being the largest democracy in the world. We've been recognized as such, and of course Aditya is right in pointing out that increasingly countries, not just the US but many others, are looking at India as a countervailing force against China in the Indo-Pacific, which is probably the primary reason why you have these countries rolling out the red carpet for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, from the United States to France. They're all wooing India because they do see India as a very important player to protect their own interests and the interests of many other countries in the Indo-Pacific against China. But the geopolitical aspect apart, you touched, Aditya, on the economic aspect. Yes, nobody can deny that the Chinese economy is 5 times the size of the Indian economy. We have a long way to go as far as catching up with China is concerned. But again, the world has learned some very important lessons in the last few years, again to India's advantage. During the COVID pandemic,
Yep.
and thanks to the Russia-Ukraine war, we saw a disruption of global supply chains.
Yes.
And that has also led to, I would say, a golden opportunity for India emerging as a viable alternative. There's been so much talk about how India has the potential to be the next factory of the world, that China is the manufacturing hub,
Yes.
there is no doubt about that. But increasingly, because of the trust factors that Aditya referred to, and because we've seen global supply chain disruptions over the last few years, there are many who would rather invest in India, would rather shift their manufacturing locations from China to India, because
Right.
this is seen as not just a democracy, but a far more stable environment.
Absolutely, and that's where the expression China plus one emerged.
Yeah.
But Kartikeya, what has been Prime Minister Modi's unique take on foreign policy that has actually held us in such good stead in the last decade?
I think there are a couple of things which makes his foreign policy different from his predecessor. One is focus on cultural nationalism, that India has ancient. It has got an ancient past. It's a old nation in a new country, so we must pride ourselves in our ancient values. So that is why you find him using words like Vishwaguru, Vishwamatri, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That's one. Secondly, his focus on the cultural connect. Everyone knows before advent of Islam, you had great influence of Hindu thought in Southeast Asia. It was known as the Sea of Champa, the South China Sea. Those words were there. So, like for example, when he was in Indonesia, he spoke about the Ramayana circuit, or when he is in the other parts of Southeast Asia, there is a stress on the Buddhist circuit. That's the second. Third, I think he made a very strong effort to connect the diaspora. The only leader who connected with diaspora was before independence, and that was when Jawaharlal Nehru was sent by Mahatma Gandhi to Europe to canvass for India's freedom. That was the last time, or to say, though Vivekanand Chicago's address is important, but that was India's message to the world in context of Hinduism, but not in context of this muscle of the diaspora. So that's the third important part. The diaspora rallies are they're not just optics, but it's creating muscle throughout, because
Yes.
these are pressure groups. And the fourth thing is that he has been exceptionally prudent. A lot of times he gets lost in the word like beacon of democracy, beacon of the space. There was a very famous operation which the naval commandos did, and the princes had to go back.
Yes.
A lot of people
Yes.
wrote, but then what happened ultimately? It stood us in. It helped us
Yes.
in multiple ways.
Immensely. Yeah.
Immensely, because that was one-to-one relationship which he forged. People think I can make fun of him.
Yeah, and
in democracy.
don't forget bringing back all our students stuck in
Absolutely.
Ukraine, or
Yeah.
I think that policy is the biggest
Yeah.
of the wins that Modi has had.
Right.
Because it's not just about students, it's not just about diaspora, it's not just about the stranded
India
Indians.
first.
Yes.
It's about helping the last Indian standing or stuck outside.
Yes.
And Modi, Jaishankar and Doval, all three together have positioned themselves in a certain way and ensured that this is going to happen. You have numerous examples from Afghanistan during
Yeah.
the Taliban takeover. You have the most recent example of Qatar, the unthinkable, people on death sentence,
Yes.
8
Yeah.
former naval, officers of India, who everyone had almost given up. Their families were not almost interacting with the media, and people were saying that this is a gone case, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
suddenly there is diplomacy happening across the Middle East.
Quiet
There are
diplomacy.
multiple visits.
Beyond, far away from the cameras.
I think the last part is most important.
Yeah.
I know Emmy is not going to react to it. And,
Yeah.
it is India's ability to deal with people of interest opposed to us.
Yeah.
From Canada
Yeah.
to United States of America to Australia. I think that message has gone hard and clear to them.
Yeah.
And that it is for this reason, for past 2 months, there are no pro-Khalistani rallies in Toronto or Melbourne or Manhattan or SFO. It's just disappeared.
Yes.
I know there will be denial, but I think the message has gone loud and clear that we will get you.
Right.
Two important things that I also want to mention that have happened in the last few years is India's West Asia diplomacy. How West Asia is more inclined to be with India than any other Muslim country in the neighborhood.
Yes.
This is a very important fact.
Right.
You had a situation where we had Article 370 abrogation, and Pakistan went to the OIC and several other forums and expected the Muslim world to rebel and rise against India. That didn't
None of that happened.
UAE, Maldives, Saudi Arabia are not just investing in Kashmir,
Yes.
but at that time stood with India and said it's an internal
No,
matter.
it's a very important
I think that was a bold decision
win.
to have a Sunni alignment, because you
Yes.
know earlier in 70s and 60s the alignment was more towards the Shia side. This shift is very prominent. I don't know how will it bear result,
Right.
but this is pretty prominent. You know, we have aligned with the Sunni world.
We have, but we are still very good friends with the Shia bloc as well. I mean, you know, given the fact that we are the third
Well,
largest Shia
suppose
population.
Iran does not like Quad.
in the
I'm
world.
sure
Yeah,
they
well,
don't appreciate.
But
You know,
we're
there
friends
is
with
this-
everyone. We're friends with Israel. We're friends
I
with
was
Saudi
gonna say
Arabia.
that.
We're
What
friends
is
with
this
Iran.
phrase,
Yeah.
running with the hare and hunting with the
Hunting
hounds.
with the
Yeah.
hounds.
I think India has come to exemplify it.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you're talking about the ongoing Israel-Hamas war,
Right.
if there's one country the Palestinians trust, it is India. If there's
Yes.
one country that Israelis refer to as friends of themselves, it is India.
Yes.
If you talk about Russia-Ukraine war, it's a war that split the world down the middle.
Right.
Most of the world took a very harsh anti-Russia, anti-Putin stance.
Yes. Right.
And even in that situation, you had Prime Minister Narendra Modi making one phone call after another, or
Yes.
receiving one phone call after another from President Zelensky, President Putin. Then, of course, that famous statement, this is not an era of war.
Right.
And many leaders, including President Biden, no less, acknowledging
Yeah.
that there is room for India to act as peacemaker.
Absolutely.
You
And
know?
one big reason to watch out for the News9 Global Business Summit is the fact that two very key people that we've been talking about who've literally shaped our foreign policy in the last decade, it's Prime Minister Modi and Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar are going to be there, and we're all going to be eagerly looking forward to what they're going to be saying there. Aditya, what are your thoughts? What would the Prime
Well,
Minister talk about at
You
our
said
summit?
it, Sandeep. It's the best, it's the biggest, and it's only going grander. This
Yeah.
is the second edition of What India Thinks Today conclave. We were there for the last conclave where we had the David Cameron, who was the former Prime Minister and now the Foreign Minister.
And the Foreign
in
Minister,
UK.
yeah, exactly. Look how
And
politics changes in
yes,
2 years.
we had the UNGA President Abdullah Shahid. We
Yes.
had range of speakers from the Indian politics, from cabinet ministers and several others. And this time around, we'll have the former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott giving the global keynote speech. We'll have Prime Minister Narendra Modi, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar speaking on Global South and different aspects that have shaped India's foreign policy. And we'll have a range of speakers, India's soft power, personalities from sports, from cinema, and then we'll have, of course, people from politics, from external affairs aspect, and a lot of key speakers who have represented India in different fields.
You know, the important aspect is that at least in context of Global South, with Modi there will be continuity.
Yes.
Most of the Democrats or the leaders in democracies, either they're losing elections, they're not coming back. The people who are staying in power are all autocrats. You have North Koreans, you have Russians, you have Chinese,
Iranians, the Chinese.
Iranians, you have the Syrian administration, or you have those autocratic West Asian countries. If you look at democracies, I don't think, I really don't know about Biden, you know. I have no idea about how people will vote for Sunak. So it's a different thing. But as we know
Actually,
in
Sunak is on really sticky wickets.
Yes,
Sticky wicket,
yes.
but
The Labour,
as of now,
the Labour Party looks like
as
it's
of
coming
now,
back.
there's a
It's-
continuity.
Yes.
And continuity has its benefits.
Right.
In hindsight, Modi will be one of the few leaders to have dealt with separate US administrations.
Yeah.
It gives a deep understanding. He would understand a different Xi Jinping because he has gone through Wuhan and Mamallapuram.
Yes.
Those two experiences.
And he's been in Ladakh.
Yes,
And-
and he has been dealing with the Russians.
Yes.
So for the Global South, we will have a man next 5 years because he's all set to win.
Yes.
It's a
Well,
matter
can
of
I
number.
remind you what the PM said over the weekend? Even other governments know, Aayega to Modi hi, because they're already sending me invites.
Absolutely.
So that's
Yeah,
going to
that
be an
I-
important aspect for Global
In-
South
yeah.
because he's
all
going
of
to be
he's
there.
booked all of this year 2024, so it's like
The
very
invites
clear
are
that
pouring in.
Yeah, the invites are pouring in. The world knows that Prime Minister Modi is going to be there
Absolutely.
in 2024, and I'd like to thank my colleagues Kartikeya Sharma, Aditya Raj Kaul and Neha Khanna for joining us in this very exciting countdown to the TV9 Global Summit. India poised for the next big leap. Thanks for watching.